in fact, the government minister arrived the one day in his government Jeep Cherokee, and he had a bunch of guys with AK-47s. And he said, let's go into partnership. But, to do a deal at the barrel of a gun is not such a great plan. Did we get on to the ride?
To the riot? What was the
ride?
The ride.
The long ride.
No, we got like 10 years before that. Okay. We got to the point of you being tortured.
Okay.
And what happened, and then I was kind of like, and then you won the lawsuit against Mugabe.
Okay, and then you did a kind of bit of a quick summary, didn't you? Because we were running short of time. And so you kind of fast forwarded, I think, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, I was like, you ended up losing the farm, it was burnt down.
Yeah.
But we'll need to go into that.
Okay.
But just for context for people, if they want to hear your life story, that's all in that episode. Episode 87.
Okay.
Which you never listened back to. Okay, but see that we recorded that in January.
Yeah.
And now we're in May.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, you have ridden or walked across Zimbabwe and Namibia? Yeah,
well, I had actually started walking back on the 28th of November. I started from the farm, from Mount Carmel Farm, from the ruins of the farm, and the date was very significant, the 28th of November, because the 28th of November was the 15th anniversary of when we got the SADC Tribunal judgment. So the SADC Tribunal judgment was the judgment that said that what was taking place in Zimbabwe against property rights, against people who were trying to farm and whose farms were just being taken away from them by connected people, government minister in our case, but senior policemen, senior army officers, senior people in the civil service, that those farms that were being taken away were being wrongfully taken away. So that SADC Tribunal judgment was very key for us. And so it was on the 15th anniversary of that judgment that we set off from the ruins of the farm. Me and my horse, and then my daughter also came along for the first day, and we just got to the fence. We couldn't actually go onto the farm itself because there were, people that were on the farm that didn't want us to be there.
Living on the farm?
Well, there were various people. So it was a government minister, Nathan Shamirera, one of the founders of ZANU-PF, Robert Mugabe's party, who took the farm in the first place. And then he, shortly after taking the farm, lost his mind, literally, and then died. And then his wife was in a wheelchair, and she died. And then we don't know who they passed the farm on to, but it seems like a guy also very connected within the ruling party, who is called Chiangwa, who took the farm.
Who burnt the farm down?
Well, it was Nathan Shamirera's people. So the government minister who took the farm realized that we were not going to leave the farm without a legal kind of notice to leave the farm, that we were going to be stubborn and we were going to stick it out come what may. And he tried absolutely everything to get us off the farm. And I mean, the last, we apart from the abduction and the torture and all that thing, we had other occasions where we had similar kind of things take place to us where, I can remember one night they came around the house late at night, and they came with the police had actually arrived a little bit before, that afternoon we were taking the police to court because they were not protecting us. And the police arrived and said, we are going to Harare to answer, to speak to lawyers about your court application against us. We will not have a vehicle at the police station tonight. We suggest you get your children off the farm. And in the back of their vehicle, they had a whole lot of tires, old tires, car tires. And they then said that they were going to the belligerents who were at my parents-in-law's house about a mile and a bit away. And then they went there, and then they headed to Harare, and they obviously gave instructions to these thugs, and these thugs arrived later that night with all these tires that had been in the back of the police truck, and they lit tires all around the house, so we had these black fumes and burning flames all the way around the house, and the house was a thatched house. And then they set up plow dishes around the house, hanging from trees and whatever, and they had iron bars, and they just were beating these iron bars against these plow dishes, and it makes this incredibly loud noise, and very, very scary, late at night in the darkness, not knowing what's going to happen next, and knowing that the police have said that they're not going to help us come what may, and knowing that the police have told us that our children are not safe with these guys, and knowing that the police have actually given these guys instructions as to what to do, and not knowing what those instructions are, and so I can remember sitting there in the office, and I was trying to make phone calls, and I'm not normally a fearful person, but I can remember that night. I can remember my leg just shaking like a leaf. I was sitting down on the ground, and I just could not control my leg. It was just shaking. And I was trying to make these calls to try and get help. But, when you live in a lawless country, that, first of all, your neighbors aren't going to come and help because they're not going to be protected either. You can't protect yourself with guns. Otherwise, you're going to be put straight in jail for the rest of your life. You can't... There's basically nothing you can do in those kind of situations. But anyway, we had to make phone calls and get people to pray. And, when you're in a situation like that, it's that it's only God that can protect you. And so we made calls for people to pray. And then they burst through the door. And it was a big door that I had made myself. And they burst through, and in fact, they burst through the dining room door and the main door at the same time. And there were about 30 of them. And they had these burning tires now on wires. And they dragged these burning tires through the house and then into the courtyard, which was in the middle of the house. We had thatch, and as they pulled these tires, the flames were just leaping up. I mean, how the house didn't catch fire that night was just a miracle. But it was incredibly, incredibly scary that night.
And what did you do?
Well, they grabbed me, and my wife Laura was upstairs with the children, and she was praying Psalm 27. And we had two other people actually staying in the house at the same time as well, both people that had been jambungered, as we call it. A jambunja is a lawless eviction from your home, from your farm. And they had taken refuge with us because they had no place to live. So they were with us too, and now these guys were saying, you've got 5 minutes to get out. And we were just trying to buy time and say, no, but you can't just evict us just like this. We've got to pack our things, and we've got to, and they were just saying 5 minutes, get out in 5 minutes. And anyway, by some absolute miracle, the police did arrive that night. And it was a miracle. And this policeman walked through the door, and it was kind of like a headmaster had walked into a room of unruly school children. Not an unruly country where headmasters are not respected, but in Zimbabwe there is quite a lot of discipline in the schools, and suddenly everyone went quiet, and of course no one was arrested or anything, but at least they were told to go back to my parents-in-law's house. At that point, my parents-in-law had by this time vacated their home. They had been surrounded as well a few weeks before, and they were too old to kind of stick it out through these kind of lawless intimidation episodes. And so these guys were staying at my parents-in-law's house. And they went back to the house.
The 30 guys?
Yeah.
And who were they? Had they been hired by the government, or they...
They'd been essentially hired by Nathan Shamira, the government minister, and the government minister had told the police that you don't touch these guys, you don't arrest them, they basically got carte blanche to do what they like. And we didn't know how far their orders went, how far the violence was going to be allowed, because it's kind of, it would have been so easy for them to have killed us at any point. And we had been badly beaten up before, so, we knew that they could also badly beat us up. So the terror is in not knowing what their orders are, how far they're allowed to go, and then if they're going to follow their orders or not, because obviously group mentality, that crowd psychology is a terribly dangerous thing. And when they're high on drugs or they've had too much to drink, they can end up doing stuff that, is beyond their orders. And so that was always the thing, just not knowing. It's just living in this kind of world of not knowing all the time what's going to happen next from day to day. And so it's kind of like war. There's just, soldiers that go through war, they don't know what's going to happen next. They don't know when the enemy's going to attack. They don't know what tactics the enemy is going to employ. And we were kind of living like that as a family in a total wartime situation for years and years and years,
And was this after you'd won at the tribunal?
Yeah, this was after we'd won. So we won on the 28th of November 2008. And then Mugabe made a speech shortly after that to say, we're not going to abide by the rule of law. We're not going to abide by this judgment. And with that, the gloves were let loose. And first of all, they brought some thugs from, they tried to get people locally, and everyone refused, because they knew that we were good people and they did not want to be involved with doing terrible things to us. So eventually they got people all the way from about 400 kilometers away, right in the east of the country on the Mozambique border, to run this thing. And the guy, the pseudonym of the guy that was in charge was a guy called Landmine. He called himself Landmine. It's sort of their intimidation thing. They call themselves these names. And of course, the police would never give us his real name, although the police knew exactly who he was. And eventually, of course, we did find out his name, Lovemore Menengonda. But nothing. He was untouchable. He could do what he liked, and he could steal all our crops. He could kill our cattle. He could kill our wildlife. He could do what he liked. But there were still certain parameters, as far as, but we didn't know exactly what their orders were.
Huh. And what was in it for them? Like, why would you just...
Well, they were allowed to steal all our crops. So they literally, while we sat in the house, they used our tractors, our combines, everything to just go through all the sunflowers, all the maize, all the mangoes, all the citrus. It was harvest time. And so for months they were busy just harvesting and selling off all the crops. And so they had had no costs in obviously growing those crops at all, and they could just harvest them and sell them off.
And you couldn't do anything?
We could do nothing. We could just watch, and we made reports, and we got hold of embassies, and we took film, and we got journalists. I mean, I remember one time we got some Spanish journalists who came, and they'd gone through Afghanistan, they'd gone through Iraq, they'd gone through all the kind of war zones, and all the battles, and they said they'd never been through anything like this. I mean, that day, these guys actually came. It was daytime, and they came with rifles, and they took up positions all around the house, in the garden, behind hedges or behind trees, and they just stood there with their rifles in these kind of positions. And these Spanish guys were just, I mean, their fear was so palpable that they were just sweating. There was just perspiration just running down their faces. And I can remember thinking, we've lived like this for years and years as Zimbabwean farmers. And, you know, these guys have been through war zones and whatever. This is extreme.
And what were the people working for you doing at this point?
They were not allowed to do anything, you know. So initially, when they tried to protect us, and they did try and protect us, they got some, when they initially came around my parents-in-law's house, after Mugabe had made his speech saying that he's not going to listen to the SADC tribunal judgment, our workers came, and they, without any instruction from us at all, they you know, because our workers were hundreds of people and these were only 12 people, and they knew that their jobs would be lost, and there would be no production, and their futures would be gone. And so they actually made citizens arrests on these people, and they took them to a resettlement area, a place that had been bought by government. There were about 3.6 million hectares bought by government before this chaotic land reform, land nationalization took place. And they took them to a nearby resettlement, and they said, you know, if you want to settle, then come to a place where government has bought it, don't come and take this place. And of course, the police then just arrived in a senator's lorry, 7-ton senator's lorry, and the police just arrived, and they just arrested our workers, and they put them in jail. And they tortured them. I mean, they tortured them, first of all, on the back of the lorry with shamboks, which are whips, and then they brought them to the jail, and they used electric cable to then whip them. We actually got our lawyer to come down and take affidavits from them as to what had actually happened. But, you know, they were then in jail for weeks and weeks. And of course, in the end, there was no charge because they'd done nothing wrong. But, you know, our workers were totally intimidated. They were not allowed, to this day, from that day, in fact, it was April the 6th, 2009. From that day, they have not worked a single day. They have not been allowed to work for a single day. So it's tragic for them. And they're still in their houses today. A lot of them are still in their houses. You know, many of them were badly tortured by the thugs as well. You know, our foreman, Peter, he had his feet broken by them. Another guy, Sinos, they actually fractured his skull and they threw him into a fire. He survived, but, you know, this was the kind of treatment that our workers got. And it's the same right across Zimbabwe. You know, that's what's happened to our farm workers. So it's and they're the biggest sufferers, you know, really, because they don't have any, you know, they didn't have anywhere else to go. We were fortunate. In our case, my dad had actually bought a house in Harare, and so we were able to go to town. But our workers had nowhere else. That was their only home. And many farmers as well, that was their only home. They had nothing else,
Huh. And it was never going to be a situation when the government people came in and they were like, now we run the farm and you need to work for us or something.
Yeah, in some cases, people tried to do deals, and in fact, Nathan Shemyuri arrived the one day. The government minister arrived the one day in his government Jeep Cherokee, and he had a bunch of guys with AK-47s, and he said, let's go into partnership. But to do a deal at the barrel of a gun is not such a great plan. And we said, Minister, we want to be able to carry on farming here. If you want to evict us, then please do it legally. Don't do it illegally. And anyway, we had seen so many people come short in the past trying to do a deal with these guys, and then being, totally screwed over.
Like what?
Well, basically, okay, so for example, our current vice president of the country, Constantine Chiwenga, he came to a friend of mine, Guy Watson Smith, and Guy had an army major, I think it was, anyway, senior army officer, come onto his farm, and Guy knew the head of the army at the time, which was Chiwenga, and Guy went to the head of the army and he said, I've got this guy coming to take my farm, and Chiwenga said, oh, well, don't worry about it, you farm from Harare, instruct your workers what to do, I will sort it out in due course, and you'll be allowed to reap all your crops. And so Guy put all the money into all his crops, and then at the tobacco auction floors, General Chiwenga came to him and said, let's go out to the farm, so jump in my car. And so he jumped into his Mercedes, I think it was, and they drove out to the farm, and the general said, this is now my farm, you've got 24 hours to get off. And by then Guy had grown all his crops and put all his money into growing those crops, and that he didn't get a single cent. So then Guy went to court. The lawyers' offices were ransacked. Guy then had to get out within 24 hours with a suitcase out of the country. He's never been back home since. So that's the kind of thing that happens when you try and work with these guys. They're not, because of lawlessness. When there is no law in a country, and people think that they can do what they like because there is no law, because they're powerful, because they can, because they know that there is no accountability, then greed takes over, and they do things that are terrible, and it just here in the West, we're sitting here in London right now, and everything is ordered and comparatively speaking, and you think, well, it's impossible for someone just to come into this house and take it over, but when there is no law, then that's what happens. People can just come and take everything and treat you like absolute dirt, and it's incredible what condition people will stoop to when there is no law. You realize how fundamental to the running of society the law is when the law suddenly vanishes.
Yeah, especially government, and especially like during peacetime.
Yeah, it's kind of there's anarchy, which is one thing. During anarchy, you can kind of defend yourself. You can come together as groups of people and defend yourself. But when it's actually the government that is orchestrating the controlled anarchy, which is kind of what we had and what we still have to a certain extent, there's nothing you can do, because you've got an army of 40,000 people. There's no way that you can do anything against an army of 40,000 people. You've got a police force of 20,000 people. You've got a secret service of anything up to 40,000 people. And you never know who's part of the CIO or who's not. And, so it's a very, very difficult situation when it's the government that is orchestrating the anarchy, the lawlessness, the chaos. Because they're able to control it exactly as they want to, and they know how far they can go and how far the international community will kind of allow them to go before they become pariahs, and they kind of they're cunning, they're cunning in the way that they orchestrate this system of anarchy that has prevailed in Zimbabwe for so long.
Mm-hmm. Was anyone killed?
Yeah, I mean, we particularly at the beginning, there were a number of farmers killed. Right at the beginning, they would come. I mean, I remember the first couple of farmers particularly that got killed. The one guy was Dave Stevens, and he actually took refuge at the police station because there was chaos and his life was in danger, and these guys came and they abducted him from the police station in broad daylight, right in front of the police, took him off and killed him. And the police did nothing, and Mugabe then made a speech to say that Dave Stevens was an enemy of the people and deserved to die. And so that kind of thing, we realized that we can't. I remember the next guy was Martin Olds. Martin decided, if the police are not going to defend us and they're not going to protect us, then I have to protect myself. And Martin was a good soldier during the war years, and he was a very good hunter, and he had quite a few hunting weapons, and Martin did defend himself, and what the police did was that they put police roadblocks to stop any neighbors coming anywhere near to help Martin, and then they sent in, there were about 70 guys with guns. There were 4 professional snipers that were sent in with proper sniper weapons. And Martin was against this whole horde, and there was no way that he was going to survive very long. And eventually, they set his house on fire, and he retreated into the bathroom, ran the bath, got into the bath to try and escape the heat, because he knew that, of course, as soon as he went out of the house, then they would kill him. And anyway, a sniper managed to get him through the window of the bathroom. And, so we knew that there was no way that we could defend ourselves with guns. And I never had a gun in the house right the way through all the years that we lived under this tyranny. Because I knew that as soon as you have a gun, actually they will turn the gun on you. So yeah, it was a walk of faith, and a walk of trying to overcome fear.
So why do you think those guys were killed and not you?
They just wanted to make examples of people, and so there were lots of other people killed as well. We thankfully, my father-in-law did end up dying as a result of his injuries. So I was very fortunate with my injuries in that they did fracture my skull and broke my ribs, and by God's grace I survived, but I could have just as easily have died.
And so I guess a lot of people would have just left, or a lot of people would be listening to this and be like, why wouldn't you just move back to England and just start a new life? And
yeah, no, it's a good question. And, for anyone that did, I don't blame them anyway at all, because, the odds are stacked up, and the odds are very, they're not good, first of all, of you being able to stay on your farm, and secondly, of you even escaping with your life, So, and, in some ways I still pity the guys that are still on farms, because there are still, very, very few people still on their farms. Maybe 5% that are still on their farms, and they've lived with this now for 24 years, nearly quarter of a century, and to live with that level of uncertainty, with the levels of fear, with the levels of just despair at times, is pretty hard. It's extreme, actually, and so in some ways, when finally they did burn down our houses, and we did leave the farm, it was kind of a freeing thing, but for me, going back to your question, why didn't I leave before that? I guess we all have a bit of a fighting spirit within us, and we know what's right. Each of us know what's right in our hearts, and you want to fight for what is right. And if you don't fight for what's right, then you kind of don't want to tell your children, well, I just packed up and left. You want to have done everything possible to have fought for what was right, and I think we did that. I think my children can be very proud that we did everything absolutely that we could to fight for justice, to fight for righteousness, to do what was possible under the circumstances in trying to level the playing field when it was totally tipped up against us. And I think what we achieved in the SEDEC tribunal was something miraculous. And I know that obviously Mugabe didn't listen to it, and the present government, which is just a continuation of Mugabe's government, essentially hasn't listened to it. But that judgment still stands, and it's still final and binding, and there's nothing they can do to change that judgment. And that judgment says that our farm is our farm. It looked at all the history of the farm. It looked at the whole acquisition of farms, right back to the 1890s. And it said, no, your farm is your farm. And this was an African court. It's a bona fide bit of title that you possess. You haven't stolen it. You've bought it. You've built on it. If government want to take it, they have to first of all compensate you and do things in a legal way. And so that judgment stands, and it will continue to stand so long and until finally the Zimbabwe government, whichever government it is in the future, realizes that it has to abide by it. And at the moment there's all sorts of financial consequences for them not abiding by that judgment.
Like what? Sanctions or something?
Well, one of the things that I did was I went to the States, and I was asked to speak on 2 occasions, actually, and testify in the House of Representatives before the Foreign Affairs Committee. And what they subsequently did was that they incorporated that judgment into the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act. And basically, the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act in America is an act that says that the American government will be fully behind any government in the future that wants to uphold the rule of law and human rights and democracy in Zimbabwe, and will make available essentially a Marshall-type plan to rebuild Zimbabwe, and put lots of financial effort into making sure that Zimbabwe can reconstruct and get itself going again. But the fundamentals have to be in place first, and if the fundamentals are not in place, i.e. if the SADC Tribunal judgment is not adhered to, and if democracy is not adhered to, and the good things that we should value very highly in the West, the rule of law, then money, international money, the Americans will block international money essentially going into Zimbabwe from IMF and World Bank and those kind of programs, because otherwise it's just pouring good money after bad.
And is that what's happening? They've stopped those flows.
They've stopped those flows, yeah. Huh. Yeah. So the Zimbabwe government has found all sorts of other ways to raise money, and of course we've got lots of minerals, we've got lots of gold, we've got lots of diamonds, we've got lots of platinum, chrome, we've got every mineral that you can imagine. But it's crunching. The Zimbabwe government owes the international communities billions of dollars, and our currency has obviously suffered. We're now on our 6th different currency. We just launched this thing called the ZiG, which is the Zimbabwe gold-backed currency, but everyone knows that it's not backed by gold because no auditors are allowed to come and see where the gold might be. And so no one trusts that currency, just the same as no one trusted any previous currency. And so they're just printing it again, and it's running just like every other currency is run. So, it becomes more and more difficult for the Zimbabwe government to keep the army happy, to keep the police force happy, to keep their civil servants happy. And, eventually we all know that through history, regimes like this that don't stick to the fundamentals, that don't respect human rights and the rule of law and democracy, eventually they do fall. It sometimes takes an awful long time, and a lot longer than we would hope, but they eventually do fall. And I was there at the Berlin Wall when it fell, and that was an amazing time, and no one believed that was possible, but it happened, and the same thing will happen in Zimbabwe eventually, just the same as every regime has fallen in history that has persecuted its people and destroyed so much.
Mm-hmm. So what did you do in the 15 years between your house being burnt down and now?
Well, I guess going back to your question about why did I stay, I realized that there was still more that I could do to try to create an environment where people could thrive, and I believe that every country that has got justice is able to release the God-given potential in the individual, where people are protected and where their property, the work of their hands, is protected, then the God-given potential in each individual is able to be released. Before that time, it's unable to be realized, and it's like uncovering hidden treasure. Suddenly people are able to thrive when the rule of law and justice is able to prevail and people are protected. And I think, I realized that very strongly, and I realized that I could make a difference by staying and doing what I could to try to see those things happen in Zimbabwe. But then at the same time, the people that have really suffered, and I think most of all about our farm workers, who it's very difficult for them to make a plan. They are kind of outcasts in society. A lot of our farm workers came from other countries. Rhodesia was a very successful country. Zimbabwe was a very successful country initially. And workers came from, Malawi, from Mozambique, from Zambia, from, many different countries where there were not many jobs, and literally on foot. And they came to work on farms in Zimbabwe because we were the breadbasket of Southern Africa. And they stayed, just like in the UK, you see a lot of Polish people, they're making their lives here. Romanian people, they're making their lives here. They're working on farms and this kind of thing because the British people don't want to do it. And, that's what happened in Zimbabwe. And so many of those people are considered as outcasts because they're kind of foreigners. And they're not from the tribes of Zimbabwe. And so no one looks after them. So the government doesn't want to look after them. The government's not good at looking after anyone, but they're on farms that have been taken over by government people, and it's embarrassing for those government people to say there's people starving on these farms, when those farms used to be the kind of hub of agricultural activity that fed the rest of Africa. And so the international aid organizations, the UN, FAO, and whatever, don't like to go on those farms because, the government ministers and people don't want them on those farms. It's embarrassing. So
because they don't know how to run the farms, basically.
Well, partly that, but partly because they're not committed to running farms. A farmer has to be on the farm, first of all. As any farmer knows, the best fertilizer is a farmer's footprint. And if the farmer's footprint isn't on the land each day, then things don't work, So, in our case, it was a guy who was in his 80s who took over the farm. He was not a farmer, he was a politician, and there was no way that he was going to make the farm work. But secondly, as a politician or as a civil servant, they don't, their primary job is other things. It's not running a farm, and running a farm costs a lot of money, and you need the bank's support in most cases to support a farming operation because it's very seasonal. When you plant a crop, sometimes, depending on what crop, it's often 12 months later before you get money, and so you need bridging finance from the banks, and you need title deeds in order to be able to get that bridging finance, and you need security so that if you run away with the money, then the bank has got your title deeds to sell off your farm if you fail to repay. And that's how the West has kind of built itself up. It's on the back of title, it's on the back of title deeds, and people being able to borrow off that collateral. And in Africa, there's very, very few places with that kind of collateral, and that's what Mugabe has managed to do. He's destroyed that collateral base. He's destroyed that wealth within the country, so that it's now totally valueless. Our farm is worth nothing at all at the moment because no one can buy or sell it. The bank can't lever. No one can lever any finance because it's not a freely tradable thing, that title deed, any longer. And so without title, countries fail. and wealth is just disappears into thin air. And likewise, I was in Rwanda in August last year, and I was just amazed what happened in Rwanda, from 1994 when there was the genocide to today, where they created 10.3 million titles. And so from thin air, they created this tremendous wealth. And every person on the land has now got a title deed and has got a value. So from thin air, this incredible wealth was created in Rwanda. And that can happen again in Zimbabwe, and can happen in the rest of Africa very easily, but it needs the political will of the leaders of Africa to say, we're relinquishing control over the land. We want to give it to the people, so that individual families, individuals on the land, individual farmers can actually own their piece of land, can own their home, can leave a finance off it, can develop it, can sell it if they want to, can leave it to their children, can plant orchards and drill boreholes and build dams and make the place work. That was the great success of Zimbabwe. We were able to leave a finance from the banks, and we built more dams than in the rest of Africa put together in Zimbabwe, apart from South Africa, because of the fact that we had title deeds, and that's, Africa should be feeding the world, but it's not. And so my quest has been really to try and show this, and try and campaign for the marginalized, the poor, try and give them a plan in the meantime. So our farm workers, teaching them how to farm when they don't have anything. So teaching them how to make compost, teaching them how to use mulch on the surface of the soil, teaching them how to basically go back to farming without any kind of any inputs whatsoever, no tractors, no diesel, no chemicals, no fertilizer, just with a hoe, and then supplying them with open pollinated seed, not the Monsanto stuff which you have to buy every single year, which obviously they cannot buy, and so they wait for handouts, and the handouts come far too late or not at all. Open pollinated seed is what farmers have grown year after year for thousands of years, and it's true seed. You can grow that seed again. You can harvest the crop and plant it again, and then plant it again and plant it again year after year, and it's a sustainable way for people to be able to carry on. But that's the quest, is trying to help those people have the dignity to be able to feed themselves and feed their families in the meantime, until we get a government that's going to respect the rule of law.
And that's just what it would be for them to feed themselves. Like, it wouldn't be enough for them to sell, or... Yeah,
I mean, they will be able to get depending on how hard they work. I mean, the only limit is obviously the amount of land that they can use, which is generally, because the land is not being used, they can normally use lots of land, so that's not a limit. But the big limit is in how much they can till by hand, and so it's how hard they're prepared to work, and if they work hard, they can easily sell quite a bit as well, But we've shown how on 1/16th of a hectare a family can feed itself for a year with $0. So that's what we're trying to bring forward, and that's something that's something good, and it's something exciting, and it's something hopeful in a country that is very often very despairing.
And is it working?
It is working, but it is difficult without property rights, because the thing about regenerative agriculture is that you are improving the land year after year. So, you're building up the fertility in the land by using compost, by using mulch on the surface of the soil, and by investing in actually giving to the land. And obviously, if you think that you're only going to be on that little bit of land for this season, your incentive to invest in that little piece of land is a lot less than if you know that you're going to be there till the next generation, you know. And that's the big thing about agriculture. It's a long-term thing. It's all about the soil. It's all about the health of the soil and adding to the fertility of the soil. And if you don't have a long-term view in agriculture, then it's difficult to inculcate the desire to make compost, for example, during the winter. It's hard work, and also it's hard work trying to change cultures. Agriculturalist farmers, we are very conservative people by nature, because we know that what our fathers did and what our grandfathers did and what our great-grandfathers did worked, and it kept the family together. And so to change anything when you've got the vagaries of the weather and drought, floods, late rains, dry patches, pests, you've got so many factors in agriculture that are beyond your control. And so that's why farmers tend to be very conservative people, because they have to do things the same way each year. If they don't, if they make a single mistake, they're out of business. And it's when you're farming, people go out of business very quickly if they do things wrong. It's it's a very unforgiving profession, farming, and so to try and change agricultural practices, and it is a culture, is slow, and it's difficult, and it needs a critical mass within a community as well. So what we've realized is that if you just train up a couple of people within a community, it's not good enough, because they then start doing well. And sadly, what then happens in African culture is there's a lot of jealousy. And rather than try and emulate the guys doing well, then people get jealous, and then they put a tagati, a spell on those people, and those people then get sick or whatever. And it's a tough thing. So you need to actually bring a whole community together, or critical mass of that community together, and teach them all together. And it sounds like a terribly inefficient way of spreading knowledge, but that's the only way really that actually works, because it's actually about changing culture as opposed to just giving good ideas to key individuals. Mm-hmm. So it's working with the culture is a really key element in trying to help people be able to thrive in these situations. Yeah.
Okay, so tell us about the long ride.
Well, I realized that without justice, we were going to continue to remain up the creek, essentially. And we went through an election on the 23rd of August last year, another election, which was a stolen election. And it's very clear that the people want change. We'd had 43 years of the same government, which has been totally disastrous for the people. More than a quarter of the population of Zimbabwe has left the country and gone to England or to South Africa or to Namibia or to wherever. And in fact, there was a survey done not long ago. If you were given the chance to leave Zimbabwe today, would you go? And the vast majority of people said yes, which is a very unusual answer for most countries. and it gives the level of hopelessness and despair that is out there in Zimbabwe. And I realized that without justice, elections will always be sham things. They will not be free and fair. They will not be the will of the people being able to be implemented, and also that people will continue to be mistreated and killed and tortured and put in jail unjustly, and all the things that we've experienced for so long will just continue if we don't have justice. And so the SADC tribunal, I realized, was absolutely key to the whole future of our country. And after we got the judgment on the 28th of November 2008, Mugabe not only said that he was going to not abide by the judgment, but he also went to huge extent to destroy the SADC tribunal itself.
Which is an international court.
Which is a regional court for 15 countries in southern Africa. So it's all the way from Tanzania and the Congo right down to South Africa, 15 countries, 400 million people in southern Africa relied on that court as our court of last resort, our supreme court, as it were, our human rights court that could adjudicate when the justice system failed in our own country. And what Mugabe did was he managed to get that court stopped from being able to function, which was a hugely destructive thing for all the countries of southern Africa that were failing, where justice systems were failing, where democracy was failing. And
what does it stand for?
The Southern African Development Community Tribunal. So it's 400 million people, and there were 9 people that signed a new protocol that said that individuals would not be able to access the tribunal any longer. But 9 people was not enough. But even so, they closed it anyway. We then took President Zuma to court in South Africa for his signature. The Tanzanian Law Society also took their president to court. And so those signatures were taken off because the court said you had no right to sign that new protocol. And so there were only now 7 signatures, and yet the tribunal remains closed today. And so I decided that I needed to bring awareness to the fact that the tribunal had been closed down, and secondly, that it had been closed down illegally. It had been closed down without any legal reason for it to be closed down. And so I decided, I could do one of 2 things. I could write a letter to the SADC Secretariat to say this has been closed down illegally, or I could decide to write a letter and not just put it in the post or whatever, but get on a horse and ride all the way from the farm gate to the SADC Tribunal, which happened to be 2,200 kilometers away. And so I decided on the latter course because I decided that would bring more awareness to the fact that of what had happened to justice within the region.
Because there was very little awareness.
Very little awareness. The strange thing is if the Europeans or a few European heads of state had got together and closed down Strasbourg, the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg, the whole world would know about it immediately, and the whole thing would be reversed, and there would be people on the streets, and every civil society organization would be, in absolute outcry. And, but in Africa, where people have lived with an injustice for so long, it was just another event on the trail of dictatorship and injustice that Mugabe should get away with closing down this court with a few of his comrades, President Zuma and others. And it kind of went almost unnoticed. And, also it was quite a new court. And so I don't think people in most countries had realized the importance of the court yet. Most of the cases had all been from Zimbabwe. I think there were 15 or 16 cases. And they had all been from Zimbabwe. And so other countries hadn't really been made aware of the efficacy of the court and how important the court was. And so civic society organizations hadn't really caught on to the fact that this was really important, and so they closed it down very quietly. And so this ride, this walk, this long journey for justice was to really bring awareness to the fact of what had happened, and that presidents can't just close down courts and think that they can just, no one's going to say anything about it. So I knew that it was going to be a tough journey, particularly going through Zimbabwe, that being on my own with a horse, sleeping out under the stars each night, I was kind of vulnerable, and I decided that the only way to really do it would be to keep very quiet going through Zimbabwe. And I literally just went on a compass bearing, heading west, kept away from roads. I didn't see a car for weeks and weeks.
You just go through fields?
Yeah, and the crazy thing is, in England, if you tried to set off with a horse heading in a westerly direction, within about half a mile you'd hit a fence, and you would come to a bit of a stop. But in Zimbabwe, I did 800 kilometers without hitting a single fence because there's no property rights, so no one has fences. And so no, when there's no property rights, no one really looks after the land. No one's responsible for the land. So no one manages the grazing. No one, everyone can kind of wander wherever they like at will. The cattle can wander wherever they like at will. And so, you get these massive other problems, environmental problems. You get massive erosion problems. You get huge siltation problems in the rivers. You get you get the topsoil being washed away. You get gully erosion and all this kind of thing, because there's no management of the land.
And it's all farmland that you're walking through.
It was, mostly all farmland. So the first bit was through former commercial farming land. So farms that were owned essentially by friends of mine. And then from there it was through resettlement areas, which government had bought in the 1980s and 1990s. Again, no fences, no property rights were given to those people either. And then it was through the communal lands, which are places that were never given title deeds. So they were sort of tribal lands.
But not jungle or anything. They were still...
Yeah, Zimbabwe is kind of savanna. We don't have rainforest in Zimbabwe. We have grassland, and we have thorn, and we have some thick areas as well. But basically, you can move through with a horse. You get stuck in some places with too much thorn trees or whatever, and then you have to go around. But there was not a single fence that stopped me. Yeah.
Wildlife?
Yeah. As I got further west, I got into elephant country and buffalo country and lion country. So that obviously was challenging. What
do you do?
I've I've spent a lot of time in the bush before, so I'm fairly kind of confident in the bush. Being in the bush with a horse, though, is something different, because particularly with lions, horses are meat for them, but horses are also different from what lions normally live on, and so lions are, generally are quite conservative about what they go for. But the main problem I had actually was with, I can remember coming up to some elephants at one point, and my horse had actually never seen elephants before. And I knew I was in elephant country, and, you obviously see all the elephant spoor around, and I was on an elephant trail, and I knew I was going to bump into elephants quite soon, but I had the wind coming towards me, and so I knew I would have good warning of the elephants long before they knew I was there. And sure enough, my horse suddenly stopped, and I didn't urge him forward at all, and I just waited, and these elephants, or this big cow elephant, came out about 40 yards ahead of me going across my path. And my horse looked at this elephant and never seen an elephant before, and I could see his neck just arching up and his ears like radar antenna. What is this thing? Is it carnivorous? Is it going to eat me up? And I'd had I'd spent a lot of time walking with my horse, leading my horse, because it was drought in Zimbabwe, very, very dry, no grazing or very little grazing. And so I was sparing my horse, saving my horse, and taking the pressure off my horse by walking myself, not giving him the burden of me to carry. And anyway, and a couple of days before, I'd had my bridle in the saddlebag, and I'd been going through some very thick thorn country across the Gwai River, and I was kind of going through these game trails, which were like tunnels underneath the thorn. And so my horse was obviously catching all the saddlebags on the side all the time, and unbeknown to me, a thorn had plucked out my bridle out of one of my saddlebags. It was at the top of my saddlebag, and so I was now riding without a bridle on my horse. And then the next elephant came along, and my horse suddenly decided, no, I need to get out of here really quickly. And he did a 180 degree in a single movement, and suddenly I was going at a full gallop in the opposite direction to which we had been going. So I was now going back east, and I had no bridle, and it was kind of like being in a sports car with no brakes and no steering wheel, going through trees. And I realized that I could very quickly get swept off, and I went flat down on top of my horse and round his neck like that, and I just started talking to him, and because I knew I just couldn't afford to come off, because when I had been breaking this horse in just before starting, because he was a wild horse, he had never been ridden before, I had managed to break 4 of my ribs 17 days before heading out. And my ribs were still a little bit sore, and I knew if I came off again, then it would be quite disastrous. So I just started talking to him, and I said, Sedek, because his name was Sedek, which means justice and righteousness. I said, Sedek, it's okay, we'll be okay. And I was just telling him to slow down and keep calm, and everything was going to be all right, and these elephants weren't going to eat us up. And thank God he stopped, and by a miracle I was still on his back when he did, and I just jumped off and I said, okay, come and see these elephants now, and I led him back. The elephants had actually gone by the time we got back to where they were. But after that, he never really had a problem with elephants again. He realized that they were okay, because we saw elephants quite a few times after that. I mean, but when you're on a horse, you always know what's around you. So when I slept at night, I would always sleep, and he would often lie down beside me, but he would be standing up most of the night. But I would keep a wary eye, just looking at his ears. If you look at a horse's ears, you always know what's around you and where there might be danger, because they know long before you do. Their senses are so much keener than ours, where anything is and what dangers there might be. And of course, when you're in the bush, you're always looking out for spoor. You're always looking out for what's on the ground, and you know the sounds of things. You know the lion's roar. The nut lion spoor. It's a question of just keeping very wary all the time when you're in the bush of what's around.
Where did you find the horse?
The horse was actually he was a rescue horse. So he was on a farm, and this lady down in Bulawayo, which is in the south of our country, she was involved with rescuing, or still is rescuing, animals that are being badly treated or needing rescuing. And so this horse was on a farm, and she rescued it from the farm because it wasn't being looked after. A lot of farmers who left their farms, couldn't get their animals off. They couldn't get anything off. They couldn't get their tractors off. They couldn't even get their clothes off in many instances. So, every farm used to have horses, and so this was one of those horses from a farm, and he was just such a great horse, and we bonded so well together, and because it was just him and I, for all the way across Zimbabwe, it was just him and I, all day and all night, looking after each other.
How many days was that bit?
Well, that was 23 days going across Zimbabwe. It was 800 kilometers, so we were going pretty long distances each day, considering there was no grazing, and considering we had no support whatsoever. So it was, and considering also we didn't know where we were next going to find water, and just trying to find water every day and trying to find grazing each day, because obviously he needed to spend 6 hours grazing or whatever each day in order to be able to keep going.
Did you come across many people?
As we headed west towards the drier areas, there were less and less people, but normally every day I would come across people, and of course you can always see where people are by the footpaths and human spoor on the paths, and then wherever there's cattle, there's people, so wherever you hear cowbells, okay, well, there's people around here, and where there's people and where there's cattle, there's water, so then you would seek out the herder. I would seek out the herder and say, do you know where the nearest water is? And often it would be quite a long way away, but most of the time, I would get to a house, a mud hut, generally speaking, in the middle of the bush, and I'd ask them where the nearest water was, and obviously they would have to go and fetch water every day for their own use, and So, and what was actually just so amazing, Delia, about that time was that, a lot of those people, because I was way off the roads and stuff, a lot of those people had never seen a white man before, and they'd been fed propaganda for years and years by the state. We've only got one television station in the country, and that's a government one. We're the only country left in Africa with one television station. And that's just spews out government propaganda, and the same with the radio stations. It's just government propaganda. And it's, a lot of it through this time has been, all about the white man and how evil the white man is and all this kind of thing. So I was a little bit unsure how I would be received. I've never had a problem in the towns before as a white person. In fact, quite the opposite. But out in the countryside, I thought, well, maybe they will have bought the government propaganda that we're all evil because we happen to have a white-coloured skin. But I experienced the total opposite of that. And every place that I got to, they were just so kind and welcoming and hospitable and interested. And, and I would say, where's the nearest water? And they would say, maybe 3 kilometers over there. And then they'd say, no, but wait. And then they'd literally run. In almost every instance, they'd run. It was amazing. They'd run to their house. And they'd come out with a 20-litre bucket of water, which you knew had been carried on their heads for kilometers. And they would give me some water for my horse and give me water for myself. And often invite me for food, even though I knew that they had so little food as well. And so it was it was an incredibly humbling thing being, vulnerable like that amongst our people in Zimbabwe who live out there with nothing and are prepared to share the very, very little that they have with a total stranger from a totally different tribe. Amazing.
What would you do for food otherwise?
I carried a certain amount in my saddlebags, but I actually went pretty hungry. I lost 21 pounds in 23 days, so I did lose weight during my trial, and I didn't start fat. So I did go pretty hungry along the way, but it was very hot. It was, a lot of the days it was 40 degrees centigrade, and all you're really thinking about is water. As food doesn't even cross your mind when you're thirsty. So I kind of survived, with very little food, and then I took a break over Christmas, and Christmas is obviously always a good time to fill up with food, and then I started again in January. Actually, the beginning of February, I started again now going through Namibia, and I went all the way through Western Namibia, and then headed southwest to Windhoek, where the SADC tribunal should sit, and where the building still is, but which isn't allowed to function at the moment because of a few individuals.
How long was that bit?
That took me, I think it was just over 40 days, and that was also, it was very different actually, because I knew that I didn't have the government against me in Namibia, so I was able to go along roads. I was able to be public about what I was doing, and it was quite amazing how, Namibia is a very, there's very few people in Namibia. I think after Mongolia, it's the least populated country in the world. even less than Australia or places like that, Canada. There's very few people in Namibia because it's a very dry country. And I was terrified going through Namibia because I knew it was so dry, and I also knew that there were a lot of fences in Namibia, and that with a horse, you need to be able to get to water every day, particularly when it's really hot and dry, and when there's fences, it becomes very difficult. And so I was really terrified of how I would find water when I got to Namibia, and I realized also that all the farm gates get locked, so it's not like you can just walk down a farm road and find a windmill or a borehole somewhere along the farm road, and along the main roads there's obviously no water, and so and the towns are so far apart, and there's no way that you can carry water. But what I found, because a horse needs to drink 25-30 liters a day, so to carry that amount of water is you'd break the horse's back, so you have to find water every day. You might be able to go 2 days without water, but
that's why people take camels.
Yeah. Well, in Australia it's good camel country, but Namibia, there's a few camels actually along the coast, but I decided I needed a mule because a mule can go a lot longer. Donkeys are desert creatures, and they can go longer than a horse without water, and so I took a mule. And also it was very difficult to get my horse across the border because of all the veterinary controls. So I borrowed a mule from some farmers in Namibia, and I went through the first few hundred kilometers with this mule. But this mule was actually a very tough animal to travel with. He was the most willful animal that I've ever had to deal with, and he really couldn't cope with being on his own without other horses or donkeys or mules. And although we created this incredible bond together, he would just want to try and find other horses, and he would constantly want to break away. And so it was really, really hard work, being with this mule 24 hours a day, and very, very tiring. And he was so strong. And he broke away on a few occasions. And when he broke away, he would just run, and I would then have to find a vehicle. And it would sometimes be 30 kilometers or more by the time I caught up with him. And then it would be impossible to catch him. I'd have to get him driven into a kraal, try and find a kraal to drive him into, that he couldn't jump, because a mule can jump. I mean, it can jump fences this high. They're incredible jumpers. And he was very, very hard work. And so eventually, his name was Nikeo, which means to overcome. And anyway, he overcame me, and I think I was very fortunate on a few occasions not to end up, getting very seriously injured or even killed by him, because on the one occasion he had got away and I caught him, and he just then dodged around me, and the next thing I knew, I was literally flying, holding onto his rope, flying through the air horizontally, and I just saw these hooves just coming straight towards me, and a mule's hooves are incredibly powerful. They can just destroy things like horses. Horses are very mild compared to mules, and they can kill lions. They're incredible animals, mules. And
What? How?
yeah, absolutely, with their hooves. And they just, I mean, when finally I gave up with this mule, okay, so these hooves were just coming towards me, and I was flying through the air, and I just thought, I'm done. I'm finished. And I just closed my eyes, and I let go of the rope, and then just amazingly, and I just landed on the ground, and I had sprained my thumb, and got a few grazes and whatever. But I thought, did he get my head or did he get my chest? Because I closed my eyes when the hooves were here, and I just felt, and there was no blood, and I thought, well, the adrenaline is stopping the pain. And anyway, amazingly, he had obviously just missed me by that much. But later, when finally I gave up with this mule, got a horse box in and loaded him, this mule had literally, he got in a horse box, and I got into the horse box after him, and I hugged him, and I said goodbye to him, and I was really sad, and I was literally, emotional. I was in tears, because I just loved that animal, and then I got out of the horse box, and Talani, who had been with me, she drove away with this mule, and the next thing I heard was kicking, and these roads in Namibia are just long, and they're straight, and they go on and on and on, and it's very flat, and I just heard this kicking and kicking and kicking, and then I saw eventually the Land Rover and the horse box disappear from sight because they were so far away, and I could still hear this kicking, and then I realized I'd left my hat in the horse box, and I phoned Talani and I said, I can't go on without my hat. Can you please turn around? And so she turned around, she came back, and there was this hole in this metal horse box that this mule had just kicked, this massive hole about 4 foot high and 2 feet wide. And the mule had no injuries whatsoever, but the horse box was just destroyed. That's how strong a mule is.
Do you have
This mule had been attacked by lions before, and had scars to prove it on its back. So they're fierce animals. Mules.
Did you have to buy a new horse box?
No, they managed to. Well, I think the hole is actually still there, but Talani patched it up with a bit of plywood to begin with, and then I'm sure she's fixed it by now. But after that, I realized that you cannot travel with a mule on its own unless it's used to doing that. I've traveled with mules before, but I had 2 of them, and then they're fine. But to travel with a mule on its own is very difficult.
Huh. So then what?
So then I got a horse, and some people lent me a horse. The Namibian farmers then kind of kicked in, and they realized what I was doing, and I think they saw they'd been watching from afar what was going on in Zimbabwe for all these years, and they'd seen over the last 24 years what had happened to Zimbabwe, how Zimbabwe had been destroyed, how its people were now in poverty, and how bad things were, and they felt, I think, powerless, like a lot of people, powerless. How do we help fellow farmers? How do we show our support for them? And then suddenly there was this Zimbabwean farmer who was walking through their country with a horse or with a mule to begin with, and they just wanted to help, and it was just so amazing how these Namibian farmers then started helping, and from just sleeping out under the stars every night, suddenly farmers were were just opening their doors to me and saying, come and stay with us, and come and just showering me with gifts of biltong, dried meat and rusks and other things, and and I was saying, no, my saddlebags are full, I can't take any more, and it was just an amazing thing. And then so I had that horse for a little bit, but that horse wasn't a great horse, and well, he was a bit tired, and then another farmer came along, and he saw that I was struggling a little bit with this horse, and he said, do you want another horse? And I said, well, that would be great. And anyway, he came along that evening or the next morning with another horse called Johnny, and this horse was amazing, and Johnny took me all the way through to the SADC tribunal, to Windhoek, which I got to on the 18th of March finally. But by then, I mean, I was riding with 30 other horses. People just joined me along the way, and it was just this incredible kind of camaraderie of people just wanting to see justice done, wanting to see the SADC tribunal reopened, wanting to see justice prevail in Zimbabwe and beyond, wanting Africa and Africans to be able to thrive because justice was in existence. And so it was really so heartwarming to ride into town with Johnny and all these other horses, and my daughter also flew out, having been there right at the beginning. She was there right at the end, and so we got to the SADC tribunal, and there was a lot of press there as well, and we delivered a petition to the SADC tribunal and to the SADC secretariat, which is there to uphold the organs of the Southern African Development Community, of which one of them is the tribunal. And then I said a prayer, and I'd actually written out the prayer, and I was with our lawyer, who had been our lawyer back in 2007 and 2008 in Windhoek, a lovely lady called Eliza Ngula, and she, all the journalists and everything had left by then, and we were just together by the door of the tribunal, and I said, I want to tape this onto the wall of the tribunal, And she said, well, why don't you put it on the door? And I said, yeah, that's a really good idea. And she said she knows the judges and everything, or the people in the tribunal. They're obviously not the SADC tribunal judges any longer, but it's operating as a high court in Namibia. And she said she would make sure that the prayer stayed on the door. And so she and I put this prayer on the door of the tribunal, and it was kind of almost a Martin Luther moment, nailing his thesis to the door, and Elisa and I taping this prayer to the door, and as far as I know, that prayer is still there on the door of the SADC tribunal.
What does it say?
It goes through everything that's happened, and it asks for justice, asks for the SADC tribunal to be reopened, and what that will mean for the 400 million people in Southern Africa, and how important it is for people to thrive, for justice to be able to prevail, and the court to be reopened. So it's a wonderful thing that prayer is certainly, when I last heard, still there. this week actually we had a bad judgment from the Constitutional Court in South Africa to say that we'd launched a whole application through the South African courts, and this was now the compensation side to President Zuma having closed down the SADC tribunal. And the Constitutional Court unfortunately said prescription has taken place. You should have put your claim for compensation in immediately after President Zuma took the SADC tribunal away. Instead, you took President Zuma to court to say he had acted wrongfully, and we waited until the Constitutional Court had made its decision that Zuma had acted wrongfully before we put in the claim. Anyway, the Constitutional Court said you should have put your claim in first, which is unfortunate and sad, but anyway, it's a full stop at the end of that journey for compensation. But it's just a full stop. It's not the end of the road to justice, and we will continue on the long ride, essentially.
And what will justice look like?
Justice essentially will look like the SADC tribunal reopening, the decisions of the SADC tribunal, the judgments of the SADC tribunal being adhered to.
Meaning?
Well, in our case, meaning that we should be allowed to farm our farm, and our workers should be able to work again. Our crops should be able to be grown. Our stock should be able to be restocked. We should be able to rebuild our houses. That's what it would mean.
Okay, and what do you want anyone to know who's listening to this now?
I think the main thing is that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and I think we were not vigilant enough in Zimbabwe, maybe, in trying to protect our freedom. We've reaped the consequences of not being diligent enough in protecting our freedom. And freedom can collapse anywhere. When justice fails in a country, it's a very, very quick road to destruction. And when justice fails, freedom fails. Freedom is only there as a result of justice being in existence. And when justice fails, the thing that happens is that fear takes its place. And even in the West, I see it's a different kind of fear, but I see that there is fear in the West in countries that used to be free. Fear is creeping in, and those are warning bells to me in the West. When people are afraid to say things, when freedom of speech gets closed down, when we see, what happened with COVID for me was a big warning sign. When governments can basically tell people you're not allowed to go to work, you're not allowed to go out in the street, you're not allowed to go for a walk, you're not allowed to do the things that you normally do, and they bring this terrible fear into people's hearts, then people need to wake up and realize, well, is this necessary? What is the bigger picture here? Is this part of something bigger, or is this just it's unprecedented? Was it a necessary reaction? And I think citizens everywhere have to be wide awake to what governments can do to ordinary citizens in taking our freedom away, because the net result of that is very dire. in the West, fortunately, you're only reaping it a little bit. Obviously they had to print a lot of money in order to pay people to do nothing for so long. And, inflation is high and cost of living crisis, they call it over here. I mean, we kind of, they don't know what crisis is as far as cost of living is concerned when you compare it to Africa. But it's still, over here, they call it a crisis. That's as a direct result of what happened, and what governments did. And I think my message really is what's happened in Zimbabwe can happen anywhere.
And how do people find you if you want to be found, or where can they learn more? They've got to watch the documentary. Absolutely.
So there's a documentary film called Mugabe and the White African, which is on Amazon Prime, which is all about our court struggle, which gives a really good, won a BAFTA, and it's a moving documentary because it was made real time about what happened, and I think it gives a very good and fair picture of what happened because it was filmed as it was happening. And so that's a really good way of finding out more. But then the Mike Campbell Foundation there's a website for the Mike Campbell Foundation. So Mike Campbell was my father-in-law, and we set up a foundation in his name after he died as a result of his injuries, and to carry on the work. And then I've written a couple of books, Mugabe and the White African, so the same name as the documentary film was the first book. And then I wrote another book called When Governments Stumble, looking at what our reaction should be to governments that do things that are wrong. And I was writing it really from a Christian perspective. As a Christian, we should be salt and light in society. That's what Jesus calls us to be. We fail very often, but calling the church to be salt and light, and calling the church to account in some cases where we haven't been. I think the church failed in Nazi Germany very, very dismally, and I think the church is failing, a lot in today's society from being salt and light in some instances of injustice that is taking place in today's society. And the second book is called When Governments Stumble, and that's a more challenging book to kind of look at where we need to be as people in a fallen world.
But Bear Grylls said it was a great read.
Yeah, good old Bear. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Delia. Yeah, it's been really great to speak.